Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third in our current series on the Psalms. Our course is entitled The Beauty of Holiness, as you know, and we're delighted to share this third evening with you. I'll introduce our speakers in a moment, but just to run through the formats that many of you will be familiar with of these evenings first. The speakers will speak, and then there'll be a time for questions and answers, which I'll begin, and then we will finish here in the transept at about 8:30. And then I hope that lots of you will want to stay for the beautiful late night service of choral compline, which will be in the choir and will be sung to us by the lay vicars this evening. And many of you will know where the choir is, but if you're not sure, then please ask one of the stewards who are wearing the white sashes. And so we'll start compline at 8:40. So now to our speakers. Our speakers this evening need no introduction, really. John Challenger is our Assistant Director of Music, and he's most often to be found playing our amazing Father Willis organ, be it to accompany our liturgy day by day, which I'm sure he's going to say something about this evening, or giving a concert or recital, amongst many, many other things that he does and many accolades. He has recorded a number of CDs, including most recently of his organ arrangement of Holst the Planets. And if you haven't seen his video, The Planets Out of Darkness, then you need to go home and watch it straight away on our YouTube channel. Jacob Costard is our organ scholar for this academic year. He arrived here having already spent a year as an organ scholar at Hereford Cathedral. And before that, he studied at the junior department of the Royal Academy of Music. Next year, he'll be taking up the organ scholarship at Clare College, Cambridge, where he's going to read for a degree in divinity, which I think places him very well to speak to us tonight. John and Jacob are both wonderful colleagues, and I'm really delighted that they're here to speak to us this evening on the theme of the Psalms in the Anglican tradition. So please give them a warm welcome.
Well, good evening, friends, and welcome, and thank you, Anna, for that introduction, and thank you, Anna and Nick, for the invitation to speak. It is an immense privilege to live and work and worship in this place and in this community, and so to share some of our thoughts on the matter of psalms in our worship this evening is a real joy. John and I have constructed essentially a fourfold framework within which to discuss elements of psalmody, a framework which will hopefully become apparent as we go on by the alternation of speaker. So firstly, let's explore briefly some of the history of our Psalter as we find it in its current formation. That is, to explore the history of the prayer book. We must first return to early monastic communities as far back as the 4th century. Both in Eastern and Western traditions, the practice of saying or singing daily services evolved. And as you would have found out last week, this in fact developed from the tradition of Jewish worship. As early as the 9th century then, at least in the Western Church, a cycle of 8 daily services had developed. In the Roman Rite, these were known as the canonical hours, or the liturgy of the hours. And this canonical office was the principle of 4 office cycles. And unlike the other 3 cycles, this one was to be sung daily in the chancel. Of these 8 services, it's worth noting the first was often matins in the early hours of the morning, and the last of the day, compline. It's significant that the plain song, single unaccompanied line of music, which you have heard in compline so far this series and will hear later this evening, would have been the type of chant used and sung. And you can see here, beautifully illuminated. The divine office, as it became known in the church, grew in usage throughout the parishes through the Middle Ages and required the use of several books: the Psalter, to follow the Psalms, the Bible for gospel readings, and a lectionary to identify correct readings for appropriate weeks. But as the daily office evolved, these books needed to be combined into a more useful way of working, and so breviaries arose, these being larger books containing all the necessary texts and accompanying lines of music, the corresponding music for psalms particularly. The first Sarum breviary was printed in around 1475, and it's at this point we should notice that was 10 years before the beginning of the Tudor dynasty. So that's the context and the scene which is set before we reach the prayer book in its current formation. Fast forward, therefore, to the reign of Henry VIII, beginning in 1509, and fast forward to his appointment of Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1533, an appointment which, rightly or wrongly, was primarily to resolve his marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and so to be married to Anne Boleyn. And so in the 1530s then, we get a real development of translation and prayer book. At this time, Miles Coverdale produced the first complete English Bible, also the first authorized version, and the Psalter of which is used in all subsequent prayer books from that time. However, it was William Tyndale who had translated the Greek New Testament himself and whose work was cut short, being executed in 1536. Coverdale revised Tyndale's work, and where it was incomplete, drew on the Vulgate, the Latin, and Luther's German. Note, not the original Hebrew. This led to Coverdale's revised Bible, which was given official status in 1539 as the Great Bible. It is no secret that Coverdale's translation, having not been from the original Hebrew, is largely inaccurate. Very few of his translations are in any sense literal. However, they retain many of the poetic themes, most notably that of parallelism, rhyming in meaning, if not in sound. A great example of this is in Psalm 100, often known as the Jubilate. Verse 3 says, "It is he who hath made us, and not we ourselves." And not we ourselves in both Coverdale's and in the 17th century, the King James Version too. However, if we return to the Hebrew, perhaps more accurately, more literal, it is he who has made us, and we are his. Two very different pictures, whether we ourselves could possibly create ourselves, or whether in fact we are God's. However, both of these translations are getting at the idea that we are God's and rely entirely on him in our existence. And whilst I would not attempt to dissuade you by any means from learning Hebrew to appreciate the fullness and richness of the original language, perhaps it's helpful to remember what John Barton suggests, that in fact searching for an accurate translation means we're setting off on the wrong path. The task of translation has always been revered as a sacred one, yet it is not just the process of translating which is holy, but the attitude with which one approaches the task. And so a spiritual dimension is not lost in poetic translation, but in fact enhanced. Perhaps all of this is best surmised in the words of the great translator Bruce Metzger. For idiom and vocabulary, Tyndale deserves the greatest credit. For the melody and harmony, Coverdale. And so, prayer books evolved after the death of Henry VIII, and in 1549 the first English prayer book was printed. In 1552, Cranmer revised the first and produced the second, and it is these words from 1552 that are largely unaltered and we use today. In these prayer books, the Psalms are divided across 30 mornings and evenings in order that the people complete a cycle through all 150 Psalms each month. And these could indeed be said collectively, sung collectively, or privately. Most of the time, we still use these designated days. In fact, on last look, 15 of the 42 Anglican cathedrals still use the Psalms designated for each day. And this has been done for hundreds of years. And so, in continuing with the daily division of the Psalms, morning and evening, we are continuing the cycles of worship of countless generations before us.
Well, good evening, everyone, and what a delight it is to be discussing the Psalms in the very space where these Psalms echo every single day. And as Jacob has already implied, it's an utter joy to do that, and hopefully the same is true to listen to them as well. It's a real privilege. It's a living tradition, and it's something which is very particular to the Church of England, and something which we're very, very proud of. Jacob's spoken about the translation by Miles Coverdale, and I would just like to elaborate on that a little bit, to expand on Coverdale's use of English in the context of setting to music itself. The speech rhythms of this very old and poetic style, Coverdale, are themselves very musical. My God, look upon me. Why hast thou forsaken me? It's sculpted in such a way that fluid speech rhythms just happen almost without thinking. It's very musical. So regardless of the accuracy of this translation, which has been spoken about already through the weeks that we've been here, I believe it's the beauty and the musicality of the Coverdale translation. It's the reason why people still use it in this way. It works so well with Anglican chant. It's the translation that is still used in most, if not all, English cathedrals. So, two contrasting examples of the first verse of Psalm 116. Here's a recent translation. I love God because he listened to me. That's fine, but here is Coverdale. I am well pleased that the Lord hath heard the voice of my prayer. There's no need to say it that way, but I think it's rather nice if you do. Full of triplets. As I was speaking, you could hear the triplets, things flowing in threes, and that's a very musical thing. The words create a sense of flowing, which then enables harmony to flow, and that's why it's so successful. So how did Anglican chant evolve? Well, Jacob has touched on plainsong. You can imagine easily how, if you took a plainsong line, if you put some harmony underneath it, perhaps with an organ, and if you allocate each part of the harmony to a different singer, you're not actually that far away from Anglican chant as we know it today. And that's essentially what happened. In the first half of the 19th century, publications began to emerge which instructed a whole choir in how to sing psalms in harmony. But typically at this point, the majority of the text would be recited on the same chord. And it would only be at the end of a line that you would approach a cadence, which would be sung, probably, we think, in rhythm. And it was often quite florid and had lots of passing notes. It's only later on, it's only in the start of the 20th century, in fact, that these harmonic progressions which occurred at the end of the line begin to make their way towards the front of the line, and so as to have a bearing on the whole line of text. And in a moment, I'll show you how it works and what it looks like on the page. So this requires serious instruction for each singer about where each chord needs to be placed and with which syllable. This is a practice that is known as pointing. If you didn't have this, it would be chaos. Luckily, it's not normally chaos. Might be helpful to illustrate then how this actually works in practice. So here, the upper book in the image is a chant book, and it gives you your basic musical framework, and underneath you have the words. So 2 basic elements. Now, until recently, they would often have been read like this, 2 books alongside each other. This is how I remember reading psalms as a young chorister, and as a child with pretty limited concentration, it's very difficult to hold 2 books at once and work out what you're doing. I can't pretend it was entirely successful on my part. But anyway, most cathedrals nowadays have combined these 2 things into a single book, like our own Psalter, which looks like this. So you can see the chant is above the words, much easier to read. Anything below that chant, well, that's the music that is used for that text, and you can see that there are changes of chant as you go along. Now, the chant in the bottom right corner, a chant by Joseph Barnby, I will play it for you now on our new chamber organ. Any excuse? By the way, this is a copy of our Psalter that we use. It's black book, and you can see how it's laid out. So the first Anglican chants of the type you see in the book here appeared around the era of Henry Purcell, so we're talking the 18th century. We do have chants by earlier composers in our book, such as by Tallis, Tompkins, William Byrd, but these are not original compositions. They are later reworkings of a harmony by Byrd, for example, that someone has fitted to a chant so that we can use them. Joseph Barnby, who wrote that chant in the corner, and a few others such as John Stainer, who designed our cathedral organ, were instrumental in the publication of the Cathedral Psalter in 1875. And it seems to me that the majority of chants we use still today come from this 19th century period. They're the ones which have endured most successfully. And I think it's because they're quite simple, actually. There are quite a few more modern chants. A lot of them work very well, but a lot of them are a bit too spicy for my liking. And actually, a chant is going to be repeated again and again, and actually it needs to be able to bear repeated listening. And you don't want to distract from the words. So another page, more close up. Here's a chant by Bellringer. I can't actually discover what his first name is. We only have an H. You'll see here it's a chant made up of 14 bars, split into 2 halves of 7 bars each. The words of each psalm verse are split into 7 bars. You can see the lines dividing up the text. And quite simply, they have to correspond with each other. That's how it works. As I played that Barnby chant to you, though, I followed a quite basic rhythmic framework of semibreves and minims. But in fact, this never happens in real life because the words govern how quickly you move through the harmony. It's quite simple, really. You've got some other performance directions there. Where it says full, that means both decani and cantoris sing at the same time. If it doesn't say full, it's assumed that decani will take verse 3 and cantoris will take verse 4, and they will alternate. It says second part there, full and unison. The second part means that you don't start at the beginning of the chant, but you start halfway through. It's quite important that you remember that, otherwise it's total chaos. So it's not easy at all. It requires practice and familiarity, a whole group doing the same thing. you have to know which syllables you're stressing, and you have to know how fast it's going to go. There are lots of words to get confused with. Is it wherefore? Is it whereof? Is it whereby? It's also hard to write a good psalm chant, as I've said. I think it needs to be simple, primarily, simple and beautiful. This is a lovely chant by Bell Ringer. I'll play it for you. It's a good chant. I don't want to pick on Mr. Bellringer, whoever he was, but there's a weak chord for me in this chant. If you look at the start of the second half and you listen to this chord. It's just a little bit bare. And if you think about what we're doing on that chord, if you look at verse 4, for example, the king's power loveth judgment, thou hast pray. All those words are sung on that chord. So the importance of a good chant, and it's really significant because otherwise you end up hanging around on a chord that perhaps needs a little bit of help. So I stick an E sharp in that chord as well. We just help it along a little bit. Well, I won't be able to talk much about the organ tonight because there isn't time, but the organist in Anglican chant is usually free to elaborate, to choose appropriate sounds, to colour the psalms through the use of different stops and different tonal qualities. It's nice to improvise melodies around what the choir is doing, and it's part of the tradition. It's sort of improvisatory, and it's all part of what we do. I think it's important when you're playing the organ not to distract too much from what's actually going on and just sort of fit with it. And hopefully we get this balance right most of the time. And of course it can sometimes be very good when there's no organ at all and a psalm is completely unaccompanied. That can be very special sometimes. So very quickly I'll talk about some musical developments before I hand over to Jacob. We have a lovely chant here by Edward Bairstow, which goes like this. Psalm 107 is quite extensive, and Bairstow deals with it by composing 3 chants. So here are the next 2. And then he uses a technique to really deepen the experience by using the same melodic shape in the bottom chant, but he's converted it to the major, and he hasn't simply made the whole chant major. He's created a new chant, but with the same melodic contours from the earlier chant. So here is the second chant down, and Jacob will help me play the pedal note underneath. And these 3 chants come round again and again, and it creates a wonderful circularity. If anyone has been to Matins recently, they will have heard Bairstow's setting of the Lamentation, which uses a similar technique. It's using music to deepen the experience of prayer, to intensify the meaning of the words as we go through a psalm. It's not just a question of placing music to words, it's choosing the sentiment and fitting it to these very, very beautiful words. I'm going to hand back to Jacob.
Well, now that you have a sense of where this tradition has come from and where the music comes from, how music is composed for particular psalms, it's important to think about their place in our worship and why we continue this tradition. Well, firstly, the Psalms provide reassurance and comfort. This is best evident in the way that psalm chants are circular. They reoccur. The harmonies are almost mesmerizing in the way that they return. A supreme example of this is Allegri's setting of the Miserere, Psalm 51. You think about the alternation between choir and quartet for words, music which must uphold, as John's talked about. But since the 16th century, particularly in this place, we have sung a portion of the Psalms each day. And the pairing of chant to words is absolutely crucial. There are so many decisions to be made. The mood of the chant must fit the overall mood of the text. The tonality, whether it's major or minor, the pace at which words are sung, the dynamic, all these things you've seen in the Psalter. And whether certain choirs linger on certain words to underline particular themes. In Psalm 85, mercy and truth are met together, righteousness and peace have kissed each other. These might even subvert those natural speech rhythms that Coverdale has put in his translation. And this animates the space, our being, our breath, which we've learnt about. And so the spiritual dimension to singing psalms and preserving this tradition is crucial. There's a reassurance in the recitation of chants, and there's a significance to this place. Whilst psalms are said in private too, it is significant that we've said these prayers in this place, holy sites of prayer. And the combinations of text and chant are individual to certain places. And so you may find chants by Bairstow, particularly for a psalm like Psalm 84, in other places, whereas here in Salisbury, we use a chant by Walter Alcock, who was sometime organist of this cathedral church. And so these chants as well enable congregants to inhabit the spirit of a place, the essence of a place which itself was constructed for such worship. You'll notice these words, perhaps familiar, and so to find a suitable chant is crucial for enhancing our liturgy here. So take a listen to this beautiful chant. Having said all of this, the Psalms can, and rather should, challenge us. The Psalms are not comfortable. Indeed, even despite the regularity in singing psalmody and chants repeating, there is often tension when words do not align with the music, an incongruence between offering praise one moment and the need to be uplifted ourselves the next. Many psalms, in fact, start the psalmist in despair, but by the end, through their praise and talking to God, results in often the line, "Praise the Lord, O my soul." There is an unpredictability to the nature of the temperament of the psalms which will be sung on any given day. There is a mismatch sometimes between the temperature of the psalm and the room. At this time, each 27th evening, when we will sing Psalm 128 as part of the Psalms appointed, almost as an afterthought, the psalmist finishes the line in Psalm 128, "And peace be upon Israel." I think this is significant. That all of these elements get at, we sing psalms however we are found on any particular day. It is a cross-section of how we find ourselves, how we find the world when we come into this place to worship. And so to offer any suggestion of how to make sense of this would be naive, I think. But perhaps that is the very point. We contribute to a long-standing tradition by offering our own voices in this place. At this time, before God simply as we are. That requires us to be intensely vulnerable in opening ourselves to the possibility of transformation and bearing our souls before God. But after all, that is what the psalmist did.
So now, before we close our lecture, I'd like to talk about some other ways in which the Psalms have been set to music in the Anglican backdrop of especially cathedrals, but also parish churches and also domestic worship too. With a choir singing the Psalms to Anglican chant, the role of the worshipper clearly is one which is largely passive, silent prayer with a backdrop of music. This is clearly very valuable for a lot of people, but it's worth looking briefly, I think, at the opposite. Historically, how psalms have been set for very active participation by all present. And a good example of this could be found in the Genevan Psalter, I think, which evolved during the Reformation period out of the belief that plainsong psalms sung in Latin only by the clergy might be largely indecipherable to the majority of people, or people who were not sufficiently educated to understand. And so there was a belief that this had no place in corporate worship. And around 1525, the French reformer John Calvin became convinced of the need to sort this out. Simple melodies and versification of psalm words, which would be memorable for people and which they could use not just in church but also at home. And so we whiz forward to the 1560s in England, I think, and we find a setting of a psalm Jacob's already spoken about, Psalm 100, but very different here. This is a versification of Psalm 100, "O be joyful in the Lord," by William Keith. "All people that on earth do dwell, sing to the Lord with cheerful voice. Him serve with fear, his praise forth tell. Come ye before him and rejoice." We probably all know that. The melody itself is thought to be by Bourgeois, and it was designed for use either in church or at home, and we do still use it today. I'll play it for you. So I'm going to pivot from this hymn to talking about Ralph Vaughan Williams, 20th century composer. It was made more famous, this melody, by Vaughan Williams in the 20th century through his own arrangement made for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth in 1953. Here's a page from my coronation order of service, which I was delighted to be able to find. And you can see how he has put a fanfare at the beginning. It's a really spectacular setting that lots of you will know, I'm sure. All available trumpets. That's a good rubric, I think, isn't it? And again, it keeps with the spirit of what that hymn was written for, which is it was meant to be sung by everybody. For the same coronation service, Vaughan Williams composed a little motet setting. It sets Psalm 34, verse 8, "O taste and see how gracious the Lord is," which occurs only a few pages later in the service. But the mood couldn't be more different, and again, I think that reflects so wonderfully the Psalms in general, how you can move from one moment to another and be totally different. This is a very tender moment in the service. This is the moment appearing a few pages later, the point of communion in the coronation service. Very, very special. So, other settings of psalm verses which have appeared in coronations, quite a few actually. We have "O Clap Your Hands" by Orlando Gibbons, fantastic anthem for double choir, and obviously "I Was Glad" by Parry. Many of us are used to hearing very large portions of psalmody, especially in a cathedral such as here where we do the psalms for the day. If you turn up on day 6, you'll be there quite a long time, and if you turn up on day 15, you'll be there for an even longer time. But by contrast, I think it's worth looking at examples of music by composers where they've chosen just one verse, and out of that one verse created something exquisite. So Vaughan Williams is an example of this. It takes just one psalm verse, and that is enough. Henry Purcell, "Hear my prayer, O Lord, and let my crying come unto thee." That's just one psalm verse out of which grows this beautiful music. I think my favourite example, however, is Charles Villar's Stanford setting of the first verse of Psalm 119. "Blessed are those that are undefiled in the way and walk in the law of the Lord," which he sets in Latin, "Beati quorum via integra est." That's just one psalm verse out of a very, very long psalm, and out of that he's created something totally beautiful. It just goes to show you don't need loads and loads of text to write music. Just choose one line. It would be a good exercise for anyone, I think. So, let's see if I can list in maybe 1 or 2 minutes a few other examples. We could talk all night, this is the problem. Instrumental responses to verses of psalmody. Well, yesterday after Evensong, I played one of Herbert Howells's psalm preludes on the organ. And there are no words, of course, but he took, for this particular case, Psalm 23, verse 4, "Yea, though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." And he created almost a tone poem, if you like, just on the organ, no words. Outside of the Anglican realm, I could speak forever, and I fear there isn't any time to do that. But it's worth talking, perhaps, about the orchestral settings of the Psalms by Lily Boulanger, French composer. And back to the organ again, Julius Reubke's organ sonata on the 94th Psalm. Very substantial piece of music, which I'd love to learn one day. It would sound fantastic on this organ. Large-scale choral works, Handel's Messiah features an awful lot of psalmody. And last week, Shoshana mentioned the deliberate tension created in Bernstein's Chichester Psalms between Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd," sung by a lone treble, and this very violent interjection of verses from Psalm 2, "Why do the heathen so furiously rage together?" Spectacular work. How about looking at William Walton's oratorio, Belshazzar's Feast? The very radical incorporation of that famous violent final verse from Psalm 137. "Blessed be he that taketh thy children and dasheth them against the stones." And of course, he doesn't just set the words, he orchestrates it in a terribly percussive and violent way. Maybe we could look at Edward Elgar's setting, Edward Elgar's The Dream of Gerontius, setting words by Newman, of course. At the very end, Psalm 90 arrives, "Lord, thou hast been our refuge," sung by the souls in purgatory. Spectacular moment. So I could go on forever, and I fear there isn't time, but I thought it might be nice to finish with a verse by our celebrity poet, George Herbert, who himself set Psalm 23, and the first verse goes like this: The God of love my shepherd is, and he that doth me feed. While he is mine and I am his, what can I want or need? Thank you.
Wow, that was really, really fascinating and has given us so much to think about. I'm sure you'll agree. We have some time now for questions. I'm going to actually start off by asking a question, and then it'll be open to you. So please think if there's something you'd like to ask, and in a moment the stewards will come to you if you raise your hand. I'd just like to ask a little bit more, though, about something you alluded to in the talk. One of the things that I really love at Evensong Day by Day is how you manage to use the organ to create the strong emotions in the words. So whether of the anger or wrath of God or fear and trembling, I feel that you're so good at that it really, really makes you start feeling that emotion. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about that and how I love the way it makes you also be able to appreciate the colours of the organ and what it can do. Is it hard to do that? And is it unique to each player as well?
I mean, in a place like this and with such a wonderful Father Willis instrument, it's a joy every day to be able to turn up and, having thought you've exhausted the possible colours that you can create, to discover new ones. I think an instrument like this shows you what works as well. And listening to the choir, there are so many decisions to be made, though. I think a really important point that John touched on is actually the absence of the organ as well, and being able to disappear almost. And really it's just a presence that is there, but it's the choir that takes over, and then to gradually reappear at other points can colour the text wonderfully. I think it's a very individual style as well, as John said, improvising, almost an improvisatory style, and taking one verse from any particular psalms. Two organists may have different takes on those words. I think it's probably fair for that reason that John says something about it as well.
Well, it really is the joy of my life playing the psalms here in this building. And Anna, you asked about whether it's difficult. Well, I think when I started playing the organ, yes, it was hugely difficult because there's so much to look at. You have to look at the music, you have to look at the words. Sometimes you feel like you ought to look at your feet, although you're not really meant to. And it's not just that, it's knowing the organ well enough, if you're going to pull out a stop, to know that you can do it with half a glance and know that it will be the right one and that sort of thing. And you're listening for how fast the choir is singing. Some days they may be singing more quietly than you thought they would, so you need to make changes. But honestly, after quite a few years here now, I mean, this is my organ loft copy, and it doesn't really have many markings in it, because I've simply decided that I like to turn up and just make the sounds on the day. And I think maybe sometimes you arrive at a verse where I usually do the same thing because I like doing it so much, and then other times you change things. So hopefully it's different each time, and hopefully in that sense it really is a thing that is alive and is still evolving. But you'll see here these enormous 32-foot pipes in this transept. They're remarkable for the psalms. If you don't use them too much, I try not to use them too much because the effect is lost, but they create such a rumble that if you can save them for the good moments, it's probably best, I think. Yeah. Yeah, good. that a good answer?
Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? Someone here at the front?
Hi, thank you both very much. John, you sort of answered my question already. I was going to ask, do you experience sort of the Holy Spirit leading as you play? Is there for you as the organist a sense that God is intervening at that moment as well?
Well, that's actually a really good question because it touches on something that I find quite paradoxical. The short answer is yes, I do think that actually that is my offering to God, and I feel that as I'm doing it, that is my prayer. However, you also have to concentrate, and you also have to be appraising things all the time, and you have to be thinking about how you could be better. So there is this dilemma as a cathedral musician. I feel that actually one is not perhaps always worshipping because you're sort of at work and you're trying your best. So I think perhaps it happens for me later on after the service that the things are still going around my head, and maybe I take it away, and maybe that's when it happens for me. But hopefully, as people sit listening, hopefully that is other people's worship. Yeah.
I think it's a really important point that I think you're highly aware that you're colouring the liturgy, shaping something, we hope, that enables people downstairs who are not necessarily, perhaps, singing along to be able to pray. And so you're working perhaps on their behalf. Maybe that's a kind of intercession, I don't know. I think, as John says, and for me this is true, it's other moments, perhaps not when you're at work, but having the privilege of being in the building alone, at least you hope, and being able to discover these sounds and be caught out by how certain effects work particularly well. At the same time, though, being able to make decisions during the service, which stops, which sounds to use, in the same way that any one of the choristers may decide to colour certain words in a particularly special way, remains to be seen until you walk in at 5:30. And I suppose that's the joy of each day, and the fact that each day of singing the Psalms is different to the next.
Okay, I think we have another question.
Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. A less exalted question. You haven't talked very much about plain song. One thing that always puzzles me is why, when you're singing a plain song psalm, you stop for about half an hour in the middle of the verse and then go at the end of the verse, bang, straight into the next verse. What is the reason for that, please?
Well, the truth is, I don't know the answer to that. However, I'm going to do some spin, and I'm going to say that actually I love, it's often Friday evenings we do plain song, maybe with just the lay vicars, and for as long as I've heard plain song psalms being sung in the Anglican tradition, it seems to me that one verse begins and everyone piles in with the next verse without so much of a gap. The gap is in the middle, which does seem strange. It's in the middle of the verse, but I always do it because I need to hear it go down the building and come back again before we carry on. However, that's not a very good explanation, is it? But that's the reason. I find plain song so special in this building, and it makes us feel part of something far greater in history, even than Anglican chant, and it's very important here. But the same tones are coming back again and again and again. to me, that could never be boring. It's one moment in this very, very busy life where actually you're being encouraged to stop and just let it wash over you. And so for me, the gaps are really important, a really important part of that, the silence. Yeah.
Just to add to that as well, we also leave a pause when we say the Psalms, when we're having a said service. And I think it's about also absorbing the meaning of the words. So when there's a pause, I suppose it's like when you're listening to prayers. If somebody says them quite slowly, it gives the people listening a chance to think about what they're meaning and to let their own feelings and experiences at that moment interact with the words, so that you're then making all of that together somehow into a prayer. And for me, I think that's what leaving that pause does, whether we're listening to beautiful plain song singing or whether we're saying the words of the Psalms together.
Thank you.
Okay, at the back there.
Hold it up. Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you, John and Jacob. Marvelous discourses. I often wonder what happened in the transition period between the Reformation and then the coming of the Anglican Church. What the choir did, because they were still here. The vicar's choral, I suppose, was still here, and the children. And did they carry on with Latin and plain song until? Maybe nobody knows.
Yes. Particularly between Reformation and particularly the transition period and before Civil War, perhaps?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think the honest answer is, that's about a century, probably. If you think the death of Thomas Cranmer in 1556 until the 1660s, I can't say that I know entirely about that period of time. But then there's the revision of the prayer book in 1662, and the words, as I say, are largely unchanged from 1552. Of course, certain revisions, particularly to do with the monarch, I believe. I would be interested to know whether in different places it was different financially. They had choirs and vicars choral in these places, but that doesn't particularly help for such a long period of time to say about different places. I think the point is that singing has always been integral to worship on these sites, not least from the 13th century, or maybe 14th here, employing vicars choral to sing services. And I think perhaps the fact that we have choirs around the country in their current formation suggests that whatever did happen, it survived that time. I don't know whether that's a completely helpful answer, though, but I would like to know.
Do anything about psalmody?
Well, I was just going to add, possibly it's not relevant at all, but I've been thinking over the last few weeks whether we have to thank Elizabeth I more than we ever acknowledge for the diversity of what makes up our choral tradition today, because of what was being composed at the time, what had happened before her reign, and the chopping and changing that was going on in what was allowed and what wasn't allowed. You had Cranmer's to every syllable a note, where things had to be very clearly understood. And you had Elizabeth I, deeply cultured and educated and loved florid music, and only through the tensions of the time was having to let William Byrd do this in private, but absolutely not in public. And I wonder whether actually, had Elizabeth I not come along, would the Oxford movement have been quite the same? It's just, I find it interesting to know, and I'd love to know more about it. So probably not relevant, as I said.
I think we've maybe got time for 2 more questions maximum. So is there anyone else? There's someone at the front here as well. Maybe we could have one from the front and one from the back. So, or back and the front.
Hello. Thank you for the lecture. Can you hear? I'm interested in the melody and tempo. And then could you please tell me whether or not there might be the Gregory and chant-driven melody or tempo, which has been sneaked into the Anglican-driven the worship. That means the Anglican-driven way of singing in the worship context. Thanks.
Well, there are some examples of this. In our Psalter, we have one of these, I think. I think it's Psalm 114. I may be wrong about this, but Tonus Peregrinus. That's essentially plain chant that has been harmonized, probably by a 19th century contributor, and put in sort of as an antique, I think. But I can't think of many other examples of that to hand. So that's quite unusual, I think. Yeah, rare. Yeah.
I suppose the only thing to add is, in fact, something that John had said earlier, which is about the 19th century, the Victorian collection of psalms and the way that they're put together. You notice many are very similar, and if you give choristers the first few notes of a chant and ask them to sing it, they may get it right, or they may confuse it with one that's very similar if you give them a few and then they run with it. Perhaps that might say something about these chants being collected, where they came from. Possibly some, the composers would have known Gregorian chant and may have found certain melodies and inflections in those that they then take and run with in the same kind of vein, perhaps.
I think we just have time for one final question at the front here.
It's probably best that it's the last question, because it's a bit off topic. But I assume, I expect you've played the organ in, a typical local church. And I just wondered if you could say something about the experience, the sort of emotional impact on the audience, the sentiments of the psalms and the words, the difference or the impact of playing in this amazing space and this fantastic music that you've produced.
In the context of different buildings and different places, you mean? Well, that is a good question about how psalms and all music may be approached differently depending on where you are in the community you're with. And I've definitely in the past gone with choirs, cathedral choirs, to much smaller places and been part of services. And actually, a lot of the time, you have to treat the organ playing very simply. You have to strip everything back, because if you have a church organ of 10 stops, you can't pull out the clarinet or whatever, because it's going to be too loud and it's going to distract. And we have a big orchestral machine up there, which is the thing that, and an amazing acoustic. I'm a huge fan of unaccompanied psalms, and I think in so many spaces unaccompanied psalms are the best thing. It all depends on acoustics, and it's worth saying that cathedral to cathedral, church to church, every choir sings these things differently. Every choir points the Psalter differently, and they choose different chants. So it's not as though we're all operating on the same blueprint. There's an incredible richness of traditions and sort of mini traditions within each place you go to, and I think that's very special as well. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, I think we need to draw to a close there. That has been an absolutely fascinating evening. So thank you so much to John and to Jacob. I think, we all have the absolutely amazing privilege of listening to this beautiful music accompanying our psalms day by day. And it's just lovely to hear a little bit more about how it works and how you achieve that and what we can listen out for and how it works. So thank you so much for everything that you have shared with us this evening, and thank you for the privilege of all your beautiful playing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a very brief reminder before we make our way to the choir for Compline. Next week, the fourth in our series is going to be what should we make of the angry psalms? So this is a subject that's come up a few times already in the last couple of weeks, and tonight a bit as well. So if you'd like to explore that in more depth, then please come back at the same time next week, and Canon Ed and Canon Kenneth will be helping us to think about that. So thank you very much.